Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Liz Heineke. I'm a local writer and science communicator. I have written several science experiment books for kids, but I also write scientist biographies for kids in middle grade, and I've written a book for adults about Marie Curie and her friend Lily Fuller, who was a dancer inventor. And I am going to I'm going to be moderating. I hope I don't do a terrible job. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. I will do my best with the introductions. I didn't realize I'd be doing introductions, so forgive me if I stutter a bit. Yeah, come on in. Okay, we're just to my left is Jessica Nordell, who is an author, journalist, and poet. Her book, The End of Bias, was shortlisted for a number of awards. She's also a poet. Her poetry has appeared in a number of journals. She has her MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she was a distinguished graduate fellow in poetry, and has her bachelor's degree in physics, which I love this science and art combination. She lives in Minneapolis and plays drums in a dad rock cover band. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, beside Kim is Anna Faro Henderson. Did I pronounce it correctly? Thanks. PhD climate scientist who worked as an advisor to Minnesota Senator Al Franken and to Governor Mark Dayton. Her book, Core Samples, A Climate Scientist Experiments in Politics and Motherhood, was a Forward Indies winner. She has a number of publications in science, the Kenyon Review and Orion, among others. She has been the recipient of a number of grants and awards, and she teaches at the Loft Literary Center and in public libraries. Anything else I should add? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kim Todd is the author of 4 books of literary nonfiction, focusing on forgotten stories about science, nature, and history. Her most recent book, Sensational: The Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters, talks about undercover journalists who exposed societal ills in the 1880s and 90s. She has a number of science-based books too, including Sparrow, Chrysalis, and Tinkering with Eden, A Natural History of Exotic Species in America. She is Minnesota Book Award finalist. She has a number of awards. She's a faculty member in the MFA program at the University of Minnesota. So we're lucky to have these phenomenal women here with us today, talking about women in science, and we're going to hear about their books. So I'm going to start by asking each of them a question, and then I'll move into asking more general questions that any of them can answer, and we'll just pass the mic around. Okay. So Jessica writes obviously about bias, but since we're talking about women in science today, I thought I'd specifically ask about gender bias and ask you about a particular story or study that you wrote about that you found particularly interesting.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So my book is The End of Bias, A Beginning, which looks at the question of how people become less biased and discriminatory in their attitudes and behavior. So I looked at gender bias among different kinds of bias, racial bias, bias based on age, religion, disability, all sorts of things. And there were so many stories about gender bias that were interesting and illuminating, but my specific focus was on how we can tackle it, how we can solve it and diminish it. And so one of the stories that was really powerful for me was a story of a Swedish preschool that managed to reduce gender bias and stereotyping in kids. And what they had done, it wasn't really necessarily the intended outcome, but what they had done was they had started to use a gender-neutral pronoun in all of their conversations with kids. So instead of referring to boys and girls by he and she, they would refer to everyone by this one gender-neutral Swedish pronoun, which is hen, H-E-N, or they would refer to kids by their first names, but they would never say, girls come over here or look at what she's doing. They would say, okay, everyone come over here and look at what Liz is doing. and when there were people who were, whose gender was not known or whose sex was not known, they would just always refer to them as hen in a neutral way. And so what they found, what this school found when it was studied by independent researchers is that over many years of doing this, kids found their tendency to stereotype on the basis of gender decreased. And the kids were also more likely to befriend kids of the opposite sex than kids who were in schools that had not done this. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, it was like getting, sort of having less practice constantly categorizing by sex ended up changing the way kids' categories worked in their minds and changed the way that they thought about their fellow classmates. So I thought that was a really interesting outcome and a hopeful one. It shows that gender stereotyping isn't necessarily this fixed problem, but there are interventions that we can do to decrease it.
That's really interesting. Okay, Anna. So I'm fascinated, so climate science is such an important topic right now, and people have tried many, many approaches to educating the public about climate. I'm fascinated by the way your book, how you use bodily situations to illustrate abstract scientific concepts, and particularly as a woman, and I read a quote that you had said, "If I always sound like an expert, it's boring." So I like that the way that you are making science personal and connectable and tactile. So could you talk about how you figured out that you wanted to talk about climate science using your own body to connect people?
So I wrote this book over time without the intention of writing a book. So it's kind of like a backwards thing. It's more that I was writing about my experience doing the work of science research, researching climate science, and then working on environmental and clean energy policy and politics. And I was writing about it, and when I wrote about it, it was very much from my tactile experience. So just maybe a couple of examples in the book. There's a very short essay about doing field work in the Rocky Mountains, and it's this kind of like over the course of 24 hours, when you're at elevation, you wake up, it's cold, I'd be wearing like a winter hat, there might be ice on puddles, and then by the middle of the day, it was like terribly hot. Because I was working in the middle of a lake, we'd have a couple of canoes with a wood platform and be anchored out there, and it was, you're just like sweating and really get dehydrated, and then the sun sets, and again, you go back to being cold. And so having this, that experience of like almost going through a year over the course of a day was a way to just bring somebody into what is science. And so much of what we see of science is, here are like equations or facts, like here are the end results, and they're really clean and sterile, and we've scrubbed like any kind of mess or uncertainty out of them. But the actual work of science and thinking about science is super messy. And as a field-based scientist, it was literally like I would be covered in mud. I worked on a big drill rig in Ghana for a summer, and I was covered in what's called pipe dope. It's like a black lubricant for the pipes, and it just didn't wash out. It's like all over my body and my clothes and my backpack. And so it's just really physical. It just went like sort of from the political side. When I left science, it was very tied into becoming a mom and to my sense of kind of urgency and purpose and like this isn't a rehearsal, this is my life. And that was like the feeling that came with being a mom, and it was like, I wanna be out there doing stuff. And so I left the laboratory and I went to work in politics in DC in the US Senate. And when I was hired by Al Franken, I was 6 months pregnant with my second child. So for me, the experience of the Senate in politics was all moderated by being pregnant and pumping milk. So when I write about that, I use this lens of, I kept a little diary while I was pumping milk, because it's like you're sitting there for 10, 15 minutes a couple times a day, And I was just taking notes. It was just my alone time. I wasn't like I'm writing a book. It was just like I'm processing. And then when it came to writing the book, it was like, well, I'm going to write about it through the lens of pumping milk and like, you know, how much more human can we get, and how much more can we like see that the people working in politics are people, and they're messy, and maybe they smell like yogurt because they have like old sour milk on their suit.
That's awesome. Okay. Yes. Kim, I'm a big fan of your writing about women in history. And so I guess my question for you is, can you give some examples of how the historical women you've written about, how you see them shaping the role of women in science and journalism today?
So the book that's probably most relevant is a book that I wrote called Chrysalis, Maria Sibylla Merian and the Secrets of Metamorphosis. And she was a woman who was born in the mid-1600s and spent her whole life fascinated with insect metamorphosis, which they didn't really understand how it worked at the time. So she kept like 50 years of, she kept a journal, 50 years of like paintings and thoughts about what she saw when she was raising insects through their entire life cycle. And she ended up publishing 4 books on insect metamorphosis. She published 3 on the metamorphosis of European insects, and then she went to South America and wrote a book in 1705 on the metamorphosis of the insects of Suriname. And it was very interesting to trace her experience as a woman doing science, which didn't really even exist as a term when she first started working, through the centuries. So, you know, when she started, there was no way to like be a scientist. There was no, like, you couldn't get money to be a scientist. There was no government like sponsorship of scientists to do a certain kind of work. So like, if you wanted to look at insects, like, great, who cares? Go look at some insects. Like, it was surprisingly open and able for her to publish her books and get her works out there. There were a lot of like the Royal Society, which was a gathering of these kind of proto-scientists. A lot of them like had rules about, you know, whether or not women could be admitted, and very often they weren't admitted. But still, she was really able to have this pretty robust career selling and making these beautiful, interesting books about the metamorphosis of insects. And then I was, right after the book came out, I was talking with a woman who had written a biography of Beatrix Potter, so who was working in the late 1800s, and she just had an impossible time doing her science. Like, she was really interested in like fungi and studying all of these things, and the societies were totally closed to her. No one wanted to talk about it. They thought that she was an amateur, so she went and made like beautifully illustrated kids' books about bunnies. And it was also in the 19th century that Maria Sibylla Merian, whose work had been really well respected for like the century after she started publishing, her work began to be very actively criticized, and people said like, she's a woman, she's an amateur, like sometimes she wrote down things that were incorrect, she talked with like indigenous people about what they thought about things and was very like credulous. So her reputation really plummeted in that time, and that was at the time that science was professionalizing, and that all of a sudden it was something you could make money doing. You could be like a professional entomologist working for the Department of Agriculture. So it became much more competitive, and people were really interested in like drawing lines. Like, this is good science up here, and this is not good science down here. And she was considered to be down there. But I think really it's just recently, I would say in the past like 2 decades, that really she's been recognized for her contributions and been able to like be there as an inspiration for other women scientists. And I have got the sense, I am not a scientist, I'm just a science interested writer. But I've really gotten the sense, and I'd be curious to hear, what you thought about it, that a lot of women scientists just operate without a sense of there being very much history. Besides maybe like, well, there's Madame Curie, and that's it. But actually there's this really rich history, which I think is just starting to be dragged out of the dark. But I'd be curious what you thought about that, like if you had female models that, when you were going into science, or people from deeper history.
I had an undergrad mentor who was a woman, and she had gotten a PhD and postdoc, and then her husband, who was also a geologist, was hired at Brown University, where I was an undergrad, and she couldn't be a professor then. So she was just like the wife. And then eventually, she was just doing research on her own, unpaid, and eventually at some point they allowed her to be a professor. So that was, like you had like living history of people who were seen as like, once you got married, you're no longer like contributing to society, you're just contributing to a household. But we really didn't hear very much about women, and I remember going to a talk by Sally Kolstad, who's a retired professor at the U in history of science, and it was about women in science, and it was the first time I had heard, and it was the only time, like it was like, what? Like, like why, like why have we heard, like it felt pretty revolutionary, and it was just this blip, and then it went away and it wasn't part of things. But certainly being in the sciences, there's always these women who are like running labs, mentoring grad students, writing the grants, finalizing the papers, doing the statistical analysis. So it was really clear that it takes a lot of people to put out science research. It's really, really time intensive, and that there's a lot of really smart women whose names are not put forward. And it's kind of like the structure of science funding and of like the hierarchy of academics that they get sort of pushed to the side. So it felt like we were like seeing it, like I was seeing women who was like, that is the person who had this idea, that is the person who saw this project through, their name's not on anything. So it's like you're seeing it happen. So it's not just like, oh, there are women in the past we don't know about. It was like, oh, there's women right now we don't know about.
I just wanted to respond to actually something both of you said. Kim, the history you were talking about was so interesting, and it reminded me of the fact that what it sounds like is there's sort of this pattern that when a field is not very well defined, there's room for women. Like women can sort of enter it. I mean, computer science was not really a professionalized field in the 60s and 70s. Like my mom was a computer programmer in the early 70s. And I think it would have been much harder for her to become a programmer in, say, the 90s after the field had professionalized. There started to become, university computer science departments. Before that, they were all in math. And there were actually a lot of computer programmers who were women in the 80s. It started to decrease as after sort of the mid 80s, late 80s, as it became more and more professionalized. So it's just interesting that this seems to be a pattern. As a field, coheres, women often get pushed out. It also reminded me of research I came across when I was reporting for my book, which is that women tend to be more interdisciplinary in their research. Like when women are interdisciplinary, they tend to draw on more fields than men who are interdisciplinary. I think it's like 7 to 3 or something like that. And some have hypothesized that when people are not automatically welcomed into a field, they don't feel as much allegiance to it. So women might feel more free to mix and match, between these sort of artificially defined disciplines in order to create their own path, because they haven't been sort of like welcomed necessarily into the fields that are well defined.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I was writing about Marie Curie, I found out that it's all of the women associated with the periodic table, they all worked on. They either worked on or have a radioactive element named after them. It shows you the influence of Marie Curie. And she welcomed lots of women into her lab where they weren't welcomed always into men's labs, and they would go out from there into other labs. But one of the untrained workers in her lab actually discovered one of the radioactive elements that's on the periodic table. So most people have heard the name Marie Curie, right? But they don't really know what she did. It's like, these women seem like these nebulous heroes, you know, oh, Marie Curie. I remember in middle school, Barbara McClintock. Like, I was like, she was my first, like, female role model, but it is so important, so it's interesting hearing you all talk about that. And that was one of my questions, so thanks for bringing that. Okay. My next question, and this is for me because I love stories, I love a good story. So I would love to hear a story, like an interesting story, and you can go in any order from your research or your field work. I'm gonna pick on you, Hannah, because research is one of the really fun parts about writing, right? And so for you, I would like to hear about the story of when you were in a mountain lake during a lightning storm collecting samples, and also about peeing standing up. You can kick things off.
No demonstration.
So I have an essay in the book called How to Pee Standing Up, and it's a series of rules about being a woman in climate science. And I had written about this experience a long time ago, and a writing mentor read it and was like, never write about urination. Like, she was like stop, like never. But you know, one of the things that keeps people from participating is like these really simple things. Like if you don't have a place to go to the bathroom, like if you're not able to like be hygienic or take care of yourself, you can't participate. And it is like kind of horrifying that you would think in a field like science, you have all this high-tech equipment. I was working in labs that had millions of dollars of equipment, and that there would be no consideration of the most basic things, like you go out on a ship for a 12-hour shift of hard labor, wearing like a hard hat, steel-toed boots, it's the monsoon, it's really hot, you're in the sun, and there's nowhere for you to go to the bathroom. Like, it's like, are these people smart? You know, what are we, like our idea of what it means to plan things, to have good, like if you want good science, people need to be able to go to the bathroom. So I had played West African drumming music in college it was a class. It was just like a half credit. I did it for 3 of the 4 years. And then after college, I was working at a nonprofit in DC that managed US participation in international science projects. And there was a lot of work going on in Africa at large lakes. And this was to collect sediments from those lakes, and those sediments are time series. It's like a book that's holding information about past climates, past landscape, what's been living on the land, whether it was, you know, a savanna or grassland or desert, and a lot of information about monsoons, which are really relevant, like in Western Africa. And so these people who were doing this research came to my office and was like, can I come? Take me as a field hand. And I went to Ghana to work on this drill rig for 2 months, and there was a bathroom on the drill rig, but it needed to be emptied out. It was like a porta potty. And the person they had hired to do this from the town was a man, but traditionally, like in roles, this would be a woman's role. So this man never came to empty the bathroom, and I was the only woman on the expedition. There were 50 people. It was a mix of Ghanaian and American scientists, some Norwegian scientists, and I was the only female. And there was just, the bathroom would just be untended until it overflowed on the deck, and you'd have like a stream of sewage. And then they would call, and like a boat would come. It could take like a couple hours to get to our drill rig, depending on where we were. So like it might take an hour for somebody to come out, they like take the bathroom, and then they're gonna come back, you know, so it could be like 8 hours that I'm on this drill rig and there's nowhere to go to the bathroom. The men were just peeing off the deck. Like no shame, like no, you know, they just pee whenever they feel like it. It didn't actually get in the water, so if it was really hot and didn't rain, it smells like pee. Like this wasn't like a great solution, but it was just what was happening. And so I had to figure out what to do. And one of these days that this happened, it didn't happen that often because, you know, we'd wait till the whole thing overflowed. Was this lake had, it was really deep, and there was the water, it wasn't H2O below a certain depth, it was H2S, and it was actually like a poison for the fish, and every 7 years or so, you would get this overturning of the lake, and this poison would come up, and the fish would jump out because they were suffocating. And then all the fishermen would come out, and it was this huge, you just want to get all the fish because they're going to die. So there was this day, and there's fishermen everywhere, there's fish jumping up, there's fish everywhere. There hasn't been a bathroom for 8 hours, and I needed to pee. So I had to figure out how to engineer a solution. And in that same essay, I talk about this lightning storm. So one of the rules was, it's learn to pee standing up, which is just you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to figure out how to make circumstances work for you. As a PSA, if you don't go to the bathroom for an entire day, you can hurt yourself. So it's actually a safety issue for people that you don't want to encourage unhealthy behaviors. But there's also a safety first, sort of tongue-in-cheek rule, which safety should come first. But when I was collecting samples for my PhD in the Rocky Mountains, I had this lake that was above tree line. It was a 5-hour hike, and I got 20 people. I had rangers, I had people I brought with me. My PhD advisor had moved to Wyoming, he came, and we had this one day to hike all of the equipment up. I had built a boat you could hike up and then work from to retrieve sediment cores. And so we've done all of this. I'd spent hours in map libraries and on the phone, just so much logistics had gone into this, and it's the one day to collect these samples. We get there really early, we get all the stuff, all of us hike all this stuff up to the lake, we go out, we get the platform set. It was it was made of truck tire inner tubes and that kind of plastic cutting board material, and all lashed together. My advisor and I could kneel on it, but when we started pulling sediments, the water would come up to, almost to our waist. So we're kind of half underwater, everything's tied down, and it's 9 in the morning and there's lightning. And when you're above tree line, it's really serious. We had these big metal rods, so I was knee waist deep in water with a giant metal rod, and tied. We were anchored in so that we would be able to be stable, and we had to figure out what to do. And this is there's a lack of professionalism sometimes in academic science. People just don't have professional training. So my advisor, who's a professor, we had been told by the rangers were we're leaving, we are gone, this is not, there's lightning, we're about tree line, we're gone. And my advisor was well, what do you think, Anna? Should we stop? And I was well, he had 2 little kids. I was what do you think? And he was it's your PhD, it's up to you. So we kept going.
And you survived. You're still here. Yeah. Oh wait, I just got.
Oh, did you respond?
No.
Oh, no, I just think it's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because earlier, Anna, you were saying that, there's so much that happens that never makes it into the published paper, right? All of these stories, there was a paper that came out of this, but, we never get the story. And one of the things that I noticed when I was writing my book was that I'd read these papers and they'd be interesting, but when I talked to the researchers, the story of how the study actually was conducted, and all of the obstacles and all the things that went wrong and all the people that were involved or got kicked out because of bad behavior. There were all of these stories that never surfaced in actual, pristine, objective publication in Nature that actually people see. And so part of the process for me of writing the book was trying to kind of reverse engineer these papers and find out everything that had happened that led up to this shining publication that included all of the kind of color and story and beauty that you just talked about. So thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So
And they don't think to talk about it. The researchers don't even think that's important.
it's part of, the scientific method, you remove the protagonist, you remove the character,
yeah.
Everything's objective. You read my PhD and it says 100 samples were collected across 8,000 miles of Western mountains. And it doesn't say I collected them or I swam across lakes or, there's no information about that. But so my kind of hypothesis in writing this book is that when we scrub all of that personal story out, it's really good, like the scientific method is really good for getting results, but in terms of communication with the public, when you take out the humanness, then that kind of leads to this lack of trust or engagement in science because you haven't given people anything to relate to or any way to even like picture. It's like completely disembodied. And so I'm wondering if you think that there's an opportunity, like I think of it as just like building trust or interest in science, but I'm wondering about kind of like bias and what it means for people to have like a more full picture of how we get these results.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Whether the sort of disembodied nature of it breeds mistrust because it feels so abstract, it feels so divorced from someone's actual experience. I think there could be something to that. I mean, one of the main studies that I sort of start my book with is a study that led to kind of the concept of unconscious bias, which is a term that we all know about, but I was curious about like where it came from. And it was this fascinating story of this like this psychology professor, now she's a psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin, but at the time she was a graduate student who thought that her research had failed because she was not getting the answer that she expected. And it turned out that when she really dug into it, the reason she wasn't getting the answer that she expected was that the concept of unconscious bias didn't exist yet. And so her research pointed, this unexpected discovery pointed the way to the idea that there might be bias that we don't realize that we have, that we're actually acting out. And so I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question about whether the more, the more detailed description of the discoveries might lead to people trusting science more, but I certainly think that it engages people more. I mean, I had a lot of readers reach out and say like that was a really interesting story and I wouldn't have necessarily thought that this concept was connected to such a human experience.
I don't know if I have a useful answer to your question, but I have thoughts. So one is that, like, if you read a lot of 19th century scientific papers, as I do, they are full of personality, and they are full of, like, I went out and I observed this, and I was thinking this, and this was going on. And I think that kind of got stripped out as, like, the 20th century progressed, and as the papers became much more, like, math-centric, which is, like, the ultimate, like, stripping away everything personal. And so, like, yes, perhaps like maybe more scientifically valid, but less fun to read for sure. And I did see the most recent book that I wrote, which was called Sensational: The Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters, was about these women who in the late 1880s and 1890s sort of entered journalism, and they entered journalism specifically as people in women's bodies. Like, they wrote as if they were women, they talked about like the physical, like the most famous one is Nellie Bly, who goes undercover and fakes her way into an insane asylum. And she talks like about like how cold the baths were, and she talks about like them, you know, taking a comb through like the knots in her hair and just ripping it. Like it's these very embodied stories, hugely popular because they're so readable and because they have those like people to identify with, but that was also a huge avenue of criticism for them. It's like, oh, these girls, like who takes them seriously? So it's this real double-edged sword where like the stories are way much more engaging as stories, but then the more you put yourself in, the more you open yourself up for criticism.
It's also making me think like the idea of trying to engage the reader was also present much earlier with scientists. Like I'm thinking about Galileo's dialogues concerning the two world systems, which he wrote in order to persuade people that it was possible that maybe the Earth wasn't actually the thing that everything was rotating around, right? And he wrote it as a dialogue specifically because he wanted to make the science interesting to people. He thought it would be more engaging if it was presented as a dialogue between two people who didn't quite agree or see things the same way. And so, I mean, it got him in a lot of trouble, so I don't know if that was necessarily, I don't know if that's a great example. I mean, he was under house arrest for a long time. But it really engaged people, and it got people involved in the conversation in a way that I think, is something that's valuable.
It might be a change in how science is funded.
It's not the
Because-
cheese
Because you needed like a patron.
right. Yeah.
And then for patron, I work by day in philanthropy, and like you have people making decisions based on what's meaningful to them, which is very narrative story based, versus like government funding where you're trying to have this like unbiased, selection of like the most worthy research.
No, this is great. 5 minutes only? Oh my gosh. Okay. No, I was just gonna say that, but I think that's one reason that books like You All Write are so important, because they are a bridge between the academia and the public, and I think it's super important to. And last question, really quickly, because so when I write for kids in middle grade about science and about scientists, one thing I always try to write about is, were they on the gymnastics team? Were they interested, did they first get interested in science in Florida on a boat with their family? Like, what sports did they do? Because if you make science relatable, it connects people more to the science. So all of you I know have some interesting hobbies and interests outside of science and writing. So I'd be just quickly, like, how do they affect the way you see the world and how you write about it?
So poetry and drums. Anyone else? Anyone can start, yeah.
So in addition to writing nonfiction, I also write poetry, which definitely influences my nonfiction. I mean, I think about sound and image and rhythm a lot in my nonfiction writing. I read a lot of my own work out loud to myself to see if I like the way it sounds and the way that the sort of sentences and the silences fit together to create something that I hope is something that approaches a kind of musical experience, because that's what poetry is to me. It's like a music made out of words. And so, yeah, I think poetry certainly influences my nonfiction. And then drumming is also all about rhythm. So I would say rhythm influences my nonfiction writing a lot.
I also write poetry, and I think it also influences my nonfiction, and it feels to me like I write poetry and I never try to publish it as a way to, it's like, just like play, it's preserved as something, and I think of it as like when you're writing, you're kind of looking for doorways in, both for the reader and for yourself, and so writing things as poetry can open doors I wouldn't find when I'm like going head on to write creative nonfiction.
I don't write poetry.
Yet.
Okay, fair. I mean, I think I just like to be outside. I like hiking, I like backpacking, I like kayaking. And when I was in graduate school, I worked for this radio program which ran these little mini natural history essays, and the format was so basic. The writer would just like go out, observe something, ask a question about it, and research the answer to the question, and that was the whole format of these little 3-minute audio essays. How does it benefit the loon to make that like so weird noise? Like, why does it do that? Or I saw, a raven pestering a kestrel. Like, what's going on with that? What is it like hoping for? What's that interaction about? And so I think that's kind of just like what I'm doing when I'm wandering around in the woods, is generating questions, and that sort of feeds back into the writing.
That's so cool. And I love learning that women tend to be more interdisciplinary in science. But so storytelling is so important, and you're all amazing at it. So I think we're about out of time. Does anyone want to ask a question really quickly? Any questions?
What about you, Liz?
What's your amazing work?
Liz does
So,
everything.
I do music, and I write, and I was an art major in college too, before I got my science stuff.
Singer.
Oh, thank you. But I think that seeing the world more creatively always just like Anna, it opens your mind to different possibilities and gives you just lots of perspective. So I love looking at science and history through the lens of art and music and theater, and yeah, I'm all about the interdisciplinary stuff. Does anyone have any questions for our authors?
Is there a new book?
You can just, yeah.
Yeah, is there a new book that you guys are working on?
I'm working on a book that is a personal memoir that also incorporates physics and ecology.
I can't wait to read that. I'm working on a novel called Providence Murder Ballad, and it's a trashy, classy ghost story. But somebody read a draft of it and they were like, wait, is this secretly about climate change? And I was like, no, why would you say that? And then I was like, oh, okay, like like it's all like coming through.
I'm working on a YA nonfiction book also about the Girl Scout reporters, and if all goes well, I'm gonna hit send to my editor today. So, I hope all goes well.
What about you, Liz?
I just finished writing a sort of ecology history book about John Steinbeck's first wife, Carol, and a trip she took down to the Sea of, this Gulf of California, which they called the Sea of Cortez, back in 1940. So I just sent it off to my agent a few weeks ago, so fingers crossed that I can sell it. So, any other questions? Yes.
I have a question. Your example of the bias in that Swedish school,
Yeah.
what was the reason they started? Because you said it was it wasn't the main intent. So I'm curious if you can share that, if you know.
Yeah, so there had been a mandate from the Swedish government to create equal opportunity experiences for boys and girls in school. And this particular school took that really seriously. And they took videos of all of the teachers interacting with all of the preschool kids. And what they found was that the male and the teachers would treat the boys and girls differently. So they would they would have more physical contact with the girls, and they would encourage the boys to stop crying, whereas they would let the girls cry. You know, they would sort of be very sort of gender stereotyping toward the children. So the teachers decided that they wanted to stop doing that. So really the goal was to decrease the teachers' stereotyping behavior. And one of the ways they did that was they decided to just use this gender-neutral pronoun as part of a whole sort of catalog of things that they were going to do to try to treat boys and girls equally. But what they did not expect was that it would change how the children treated each other. That was sort of the surprise outcome. It was really designed to make to change the teacher's behavior, and it had this unintentional consequence of changing the students' behavior as well.
Thank you.
And do you know if they're still following through? Have you followed it?
As far as I know, last time I was in touch with them, this was just sort of the protocol now. They just use this gender-neutral pronoun. Yeah. The school is called Igalia. It's in Stockholm, and there's a sister school as well, so there are two preschools that do this.
Okay.
Yes.
I have a question for Kim. When you're talking about the history of women in science and how, you know, the woman who was talking about metamorphosis and how her work was seen as a positive thing and it was well respected, and then suddenly it kind of, that respect dissipated. Was there anything happening, I guess, politically or globally, or do you think it was just the way that time changed that, and because people were not, you know, those people who were around her at that time no longer were alive? Or...
Yeah, so I think that it was two things. One was, so she published, she was also an artist, and so her books were these large illustrations with about a paragraph of text about where she'd seen the insect or the process of metamorphosis. And because of book printing at the time, like they were all black and white, but she sold some versions that she and her daughters would color for a premium price, but most of them were black and white. So what happened over the years was, one, people colored in the black and white ones just with colors out of their imagination, right? They treated them like a coloring book. And two, her books were super popular, so they were like printed and reprinted and translated into different languages, and sometimes like the text was entirely stripped out, and sometimes and they added in 12 more plates to the Suriname book, which she had not originally considered to be part of the Suriname book. So by the time you get to the mid-19th century, like people are usually looking at a very degraded product. And also I talked about that 50 years of study book that she kept. Right after she died, Peter the Great bought that and took it to Russia. So it was out of the hands of scholars for a long time, so people couldn't see what she thought she was doing. So that was part of it, and then part of it, I think, was this professionalization, and people had this idea of what a scientist looked like, and they did not want to be associated with this kind of eccentric woman who like took her daughter when she was 50 to go look at the insects in South America. So they were really actively like drawing lines to exclude people like her. And just all of a sudden, her work was getting all these attacks.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
It was really